So the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and today on League Bound, I want to talk about the upcoming NBA draft and look at some of the players who have declared who may be staying in the draft, but also maybe more importantly, some players who have elected to return to college basketball. If you like college basketball or the NBA draft, make sure you subscribe because we're bringing you that content all year long. So today I want to start off by focusing on some players who have already declared for the NBA draft. And in this video, we're not talking about Darren Peterson, we're not talking about Cam Boozer or AJ DeBonsa. These are all guys we know are potentially superstar players. They are locks for the top of the lottery. And even some other players like a LeBaron Philon or Michael Brown or Darius Acuff, these are all guys that are locked in for the lottery and for the first round. But there are a few players that have declared for the NBA draft that some people had some criticisms of or had questions about. So I want to start with the two draft prospects from the Baylor Bears, Tunde Yesufu and Cameron Carr. Now, going into the season, as we start with Tunde Yesufu, he was somebody that had a lot of praise. He was a projected lottery pick, the physicality. People were even comparing him to an Anthony Edwards type of player, and we know what Ant-Man has done in the NBA. But some of his struggles with jump shooting and his perimeter game kind of opened some eyes and provided more criticism than maybe some were expecting. Tunde Yesufu shot just 29% from three-point range on over 5 attempts per night. And with Yesufu entering the draft, the common knowledge currently is that he looks like he's going to be staying in the draft process by the end of the deadline. And clearly there's reason for that. I mean, he has, like I've said, the physical tools to match really any prospect in this draft class. He's one of the most physically ready players to go to the next level and be playing against 25 and 30 and even 35-year-olds. And I do think there's going to be some team, maybe at the end of the lottery or maybe at the end of the first round, that looks at Tunde Yesufu and sees his raw physical abilities and the potential to grow those abilities. And he could be a sleeper pick, in the back half of the first round. And then there's Cameron Carr, who came to Baylor this season and really elevated his draft stock. He has also entered his name into the upcoming NBA draft. He was really the shining star for Baylor this season, a year that maybe wasn't what they were hoping for, but some solid performances from a guy like Cameron Carr anyways. Averaged nearly 19 points per game on 37% from downtown. He's been a near 40% guy for the last 2 seasons, albeit while at Tennessee in 2024, his shot attempts were quite a bit lower than what he got this year at Baylor, where he broke out. And without the consensus guarantee that he'd be a lottery pick in this year's draft, some people out there thought there could be a chance that a guy like Cameron Carr could return for maybe one more year and solidify himself as a first-round pick. But he has declared his name into the NBA draft, and again, just like Tunde Yesufu, it seems like there's a good chance it could stay that way. I feel like personally, Cameron Carr really increased his draft stock, and I feel like he's a name that even if he doesn't go in the lottery, he should stay in this year's draft because he can provide tremendous value to teams down, like I said, at the back half of the first round, as if he doesn't even go higher than that. I believe in the recent mock draft that you can check out on this channel here on League Bound, we had Cameron Carr going at the back portion of the lottery. So with his shooting ability, his size and length, I don't see how that's a player that teams continue to pass up on, and I don't see a future where he escapes the first round. Moving on now to the Arkansas Razorbacks, and we're talking about Malik Thomas here. Malik Thomas came to Arkansas this season alongside Darius Acuff, who, like I said earlier, might be one of the top guards in this entire draft class. But Malik Thomas was no slouch, averaged over 15 points per game, shot almost 42% from three-point range. And we saw Arkansas lose in the Sweet 16, but when you look at Malik's last 5 games of college basketball, 4 out of those 5 were really strong performances. You got 29 points in a win against Ole Miss in the SEC tournament semifinal, only 7 points in the tournament final against Vandy, but once March Madness turned on, that's where his game continued to pick up. I'm talking 21 points against Hawaii in round 1, 19 points against High Point in a shootout victory, and then 17 points to cap off his freshman season in the loss that finally ended Arkansas' season to the Arizona Wildcats. And I feel like Malik Thomas could definitely stay in this draft and be a first-round pick as one of these elite offensive prospects that still has a ways to go defensively, but he showed some jump shot acumen and an ability to just flat out put the ball in the basket as a freshman. But there is an interesting future where if Malik Thomas elects to go back to Arkansas, this is an Arkansas team that is reloading, maybe stronger than they looked even this past season. As we're talking about Malik Thomas potentially rejoining Arkansas and pairing up in the backcourt alongside Jordan Smith Jr., who is one of the top players in the freshman class going into the 2026 season. And I feel like that talent duo in the backcourt for Arkansas next year could be a repeat type of level of performance like we saw with Darius Acuff and Malik Thomas in the 2025-2026 season. But overall, wouldn't be shocked if Malik Thomas stays in this draft, as he has entered his name in there. And then another Arkansas player that has an interesting decision coming up is Billy Richmond III. I know Cam here on LeagueBound is a huge Billy Richmond supporter. He believes in his talent to get to the next level. And he had a great two-way season for the Razorbacks. Kind of played hard on both ends of the floor, flashed at times some of that athletic ability, averaged over 11 points per game on over 50% from the field, but just shot 26% from the three-point line. And as a perimeter guard, potential guard wing type player, you would like to see maybe a little bit better performance from downtown from him as a draft prospect. I feel like a guy like Billy Richmond, we're going to have to wait and see, and maybe a team will give him a promise in the draft. And I think that could be a big factor with him staying in the 2026 draft class. And one last one that has entered the draft that I really want to kind of examine is Koa Pete from the Arizona Wildcats. And while I fully believe that Koa Pete should and will stay in this draft class, he does have some valid criticism. There were some murmurs that some of his weaknesses that we saw on display in his freshman season with the Wildcats would be something better worked on with a second year completely taking over the Arizona offense. However, even though the perimeter game was certainly not his strong suit, made just 7 threes this past season, Koa Pete's finishing inside the paint, his physicality at the rim on both ends of the floor, and even some of his touch from 10 to 12 feet out on some of those fadeaway shots showed me enough that his game could definitely grow at the next level. And even if it is at the back portion of the lottery or even just outside of the lottery, he's someone that I think a team is going to love when they end their draft and have Koa Pete to develop throughout the summer league, throughout training camp, and also as we begin the season, because he's another guy like Tonde Yesufu that has that NBA-ready frame to handle any challenge he's thrown. Koa Pete played a lot of inside game alongside Mo Krivas for the Arizona Wildcats this season, and Mo Krivas has elected to return to Arizona, so if for whatever reason Koa Pete decided to take his name out of the class by the deadline, they would likely run it back and be a fearsome duo inside for Arizona, but I do think Koa Pete should and will stay in this draft class. All right, now that we have taken care of some players that maybe had some question marks but will probably stay in the draft class, let's examine some players that have already announced that they are returning to college basketball next season. I think the first big name we have to talk about here is Braylon Mullins for the UConn Huskies. And if for whatever reason you didn't watch too much of Braylon Mullins this season, you checked him out in March Madness and he had that massive shot to take down the Duke Blue Devils. Really the most iconic moment, I would say, from this year's March Madness tournament. But overall in the season, Braylon Mullins put together a pretty solid freshman campaign. Averaged 12 points, made 29 starts, shot only 33% from downtown though. And I think it may be a decent decision for him to return to UConn as a sophomore and continue to work on his game, because when he came to the collegiate level, he was projected to be an offensive juggernaut, really strong shooter. We also saw him miss a decent portion of the early season due to injury. One thing you do like is the free throw numbers. Shot nearly 90% from the stripe this season. However, it was a very limited number of attempts. And I think for me, that could be a big area of his game that can show some growth as a sophomore, being able to attack the rim, draw some contact, maybe play with a little bit more physicality to prove that he should be a lottery pick like he was projected going into this year's class. And we'll see how one of the best coaches in the entire country in Dan Hurley continues to develop a player like Braylon Mullins next year. Next, let's move on to the Florida Gators, who have announced their return to college basketball. We're talking about Thomas Houck, and we're talking about Alex Condon here. Both of them returning to Florida again next season alongside another draft potential player like a Boogie Fland. And both Thomas Houck and Alex Condon came into the season as some projected first-round picks. But even after finishing as a top seed in March Madness once again, they have elected to come back to Gainesville. Looking at Thomas Houck's season, 17 points per game, 6 rebounds, really his best season of college basketball. Nearly doubled his scoring numbers from 2024. That was the national championship team that had Walter Clayton Jr. and Will Richard, Elijah Martin, just to name a few. And then with Alex Condon, he also made some improvements in 2025. Scored over 15 points per game, snagged 7.5 boards, and his scoring jumped season over season. However, at just 11 of 28 from the three-point line, I think that's an area where in maybe his final season with the Gators, he could show that he is a foolproof, ready-made NBA player if he can expand on that perimeter game that he clearly has been working on. You think of a player like Walker Kessler in the Utah Jazz franchise, someone that has expanded his game when he started at North Carolina, moved on to Auburn, became an NBA prospect, and has made a big impact with the Utah Jazz because of his expanded offensive game. I think that's where Alex Condon could go and be a potential first-round pick when we look back at this video a year from now. Next, let's move on to the Duke Blue Devils, a team that is always loaded with talent, and they've got quite a few players that had some draft hype, but they've elected to return to college basketball next season. Some of the players I want to examine here: Caden Boozer, the brother of Cam Boozer, who was going to be maybe one of the top 3 picks in this year's draft, but also Dame Sarr and Patrick Ngamba. Those 3 are returning to Duke after a really strong showing in March Madness, nearly reaching the Final Four. Throughout the year, I feel like all 3 of these guys in different mock drafts that you could find online had some first-round hype, especially Caden Boozer. We saw going into this season, he did not have nearly as much hype as Cam, but he was still projected to be maybe a middle to late first-round pick. But when you look at Caden Boozer's season, nearly a 3-to-1 assist-to-turnover ratio, and we saw him start to take some strides, especially once Caleb Foster got injured late in the season, and he had to step up his game in order to support the Duke Blue Devils. But for Caden Boozer, with all that offensive talent that he had to work with, his scoring really wasn't on the forefront that we saw on display this year. And for a guard that had some first-round buzz, I feel like a lot of these scouts would like to see him be a little bit more impactful in the scoring side of this Duke offense. Moving things over to Dame Sarr, he had a bit of a question mark going into this season. Where could he eventually get to in terms of draft stock? Could he be a lottery pick, or would he be one of these guys that ends up returning for year 2? And it looks like the latter is going to be his solution. 6.4 points per game, 40% from the field, made 43 threes, and also moved really well in transition. We saw those long strides, and his attack mode mindset makes some big plays at the rim. I think maybe one of his late highlights was a nice game against TCU in the round of 32. 14 points and 8 rebounds, made a big impact in that game. So not too surprising that he returns for year 2. I think his level of growth could be massive in a second year under John Shire with the Duke Blue Devils. He's someone that has all the traits, right? He can move in transition, he can score the ball, even showed some 3-point distance ability. We just have to see if that development track will continue into his second year in the system. And then you've got Patrick Ngamba, made the transition into being the starting big for Duke in his second year with the program, played 30 games off the bench in 2024 in that group with Cooper Flagg and Con Knipple and company, but then also played alongside Cameron Boozer in the front court this season. So I liked seeing Patrick Ngamba's ability to develop and change his role year over year. I think that's something that scouts would be really impressed by. And he averaged double-digit points, nearly 6 rebounds a game on 60% from the field. You like to see that from a more interior-focused player like Patrick Ngamba, being able to score with high efficiency. We've seen centers in the NBA make their money doing that, playing defense and being effective at the rim when they get their chances, like a Jarrett Allen for the Cleveland Cavaliers. So I thought that Patrick Ngamba really could be one of the few centers that have remained in this class to actually make an impact and get drafted in the first round, but he has elected to return to Duke. Next up, let's look at the reigning national champions, the Michigan Wolverines, and they are reloaded because they've got some big-time players coming back for the 2026-27 season. First, I want to start off with Elliot Cadeau, a starting guard who saw some late-season injuries, worked his way back, and was a big factor in the national championship season for the Michigan Wolverines. And if you remember back a few years ago, Elliot Cadeau went to UNC as a freshman with some one-and-done hype, but it just never turned into that for him, and he has moved to the Michigan Wolverines program and really stepped up his game. He's played in over 70 games for the Tar Heels as a solid contributor before coming to Michigan, but then he elevated a lot of his offensive performances with the Maize and Blue. Scored over 10.5 points, his career best, nearly 6 assists per game as well, on 37% from three-point range. And then you look at Trey McKinney, who is kind of one of the few young players for Michigan this season, that were a key contributor. Because when you look at the Michigan roster this year, you had Adai Mara, Yaxel Lendeborg, and now Elliot Cadeau, 3 veterans that were kind of the 3-headed monster of that Michigan team. So for Trey McKinney to have found his way into an important role off the bench as kind of the key 6th man, I thought was really impressive. Scored almost 10 points per game, 39% from the 3-point line, and nearly 90% from the free throw line. McKinney was part of the 2026 All-Big Ten freshman team, while he led Michigan in 3-pointers. So I feel like Trey McKinney going into next season as a sophomore, he's going to have a lot on his plate to try to repeat with this Michigan program. And if his development goes like some hope it would, I feel like Trey McKinney could easily be a lottery pick next season. Sticking in the Big Ten here, let's move it over to the Illinois Fighting Illini, who bring back quite a few players from that Final Four team. We're talking about the Avicic brothers and Andrei Stojakovic. Now, while all 3 of these guys may not have had the highest draft stock in terms of this year's class, they were definitely guys that could have been maybe late first, but definitely 2nd-round picks. All 3 of them were key members to the Illini's run in March Madness. Andrei Stojakovic attacking the basket, and the Avicic brothers playing defense inside and hitting timely threes. I can't stress that enough. Both of them can make some big plays. And yes, Illinois was led by Keaton Wagler, the freshman, who is a lock for the lottery this season. I do feel like with the return of these 3 back under Brad Underwood's system, this is going to be a problem for the rest of the Big Ten to deal with, and if they play even better than they did this past season, we might see quite a few Illinois guys go next year in the NBA draft. But that's it for me today. What do you guys think? What do you think about these players that have elected to stay in the draft? Do you think some of them should go back to school before the deadline hits? And what do you think about the guys that have already announced they're returning to college basketball? Did it surprise you that somebody like a Braylon Mullins or a Thomas Houck are coming back to college basketball to play maybe one more season and fight for a national championship? Let me know in the comments down below what you think of all of these players' decisions. And again, if you like content like this about the NBA draft and college basketball, make sure you stay locked in here on Leaguebound because we're bringing you that content all year long. That's it for me today. We'll see you next time.